In this video we'll be looking in detail at each phase within the General Dame 2 game turn. We're going to start with command and initiative. First of all, ADCs. Command is achieved via ADCs that are used by the player to issue orders and taskings. Now this is very similar to the first edition, so anyone who's played GDA 1 will be entirely familiar with the process. There are 12 taskings that ADCs can be assigned to, and these include the brigade attachment command reroll, attaching generals for glory, increasing your brigade's movement using forwards, or increasing your artillery's rate of fire using artillery assault. Some new taskings include the skirmishes tasking, which is different, and the scouts tasking, which has been altered to now affect the initiative rather than expose fog of war cards. First of all, each player must ascertain how many ADCs he'll have available for the turn. Now, a standard sized division will have 5 ADCs, and a larger division will possibly have 6, while your smaller divisions will have 3 or 4. The French division that we'll be using in our game will be the standard 5 ADCs. So, each turn the players roll the equivalent number of D6s as they have ADCs, and an ADC will be available on a score of 3, 4, 5 or 6, or unavailable on a score of 1 or 2. So if I'll be making a roll in just a second in Richard's famous dice tray, and we'll see how many ADCs we have available. So you can see from this roll we've rolled 5 dice because we have 5 ADCs, and we have 2 dice that are 1s and 2s, meaning we only have 3 ADCs available this turn. That's ADCs. Now, in addition to ADCs, we now have CNC commands. These are a new introduction to the game and represent significant interventions by the Commander-in-Chief during the battle. As such, these are limited to either just 1 or 2 depending on your general's ability. Now these can be powerful, so players have important command decisions as to when and where to use them. Again, you'll see how these work when we play out the full battle. So, once a player has tasked his ADCs or issued a CNC command, we come to the brigade command rolls. These represent friction in the command process. Will your brigadiers obey orders promptly and crack on with it, or will they be hesitant? A brigade command roll uses exactly the same process as we had in General Dame 1. It's determined by simply rolling a d6 for each brigadier, and the brigade will obey orders on a score of 3, 4, 5 or 6, or it will be hesitant on a score of 1 or 2. Hesitant means the brigade will suffer a number of restrictions for this turn, the most significant of which is that it cannot advance towards the enemy. But remember, ADC taskings can significantly influence your command rolls, so brigade attachment rerolls can significantly reduce a hesitant brigade. Finally, players will determine who has the initiative for the turn. Initiative determines which player goes first in each phase or sub-phase of the game turn. However, this can now be influenced more directly by ADC taskings, combined with an opportunity to remove a hesitant status from a brigade by surrendering the initiative to the opponent. So, important command decisions sit with the initiative. Do you accept that one of your brigades is going to be hesitant and go first in the phases, or do you surrender the initiative to the opponent in order to remove a hesitant from one of your perhaps more important brigades that you need to get going? Now we move to the charge phase. Here, both players declare and carry out their charges in an effort to overpower their opponent. The phasing player will declare his charges first, followed by the non-phasing player. To declare a charge, the charging unit must be in command of the respective brigadier, be formed, and of course be within charge reach of the enemy. Now, players may only declare one charge per brigade, either with or without supports. So you can have a right support, a left support, or a rear support. So this is the one significant difference from GDA 1 to GDA 2. It's now one charge per brigade. We'll cover an example here. So we have a French column ready to charge. The lead French column is supported on each flank by two further columns. Both are within support distance of the 5 centimetres for 15mm figures. If you're using 28s, that will be 3 inches. First, we move the charges to the 5 centimetre point from the lead defending unit. This is the point at which all charges are resolved. The supporting columns are also moved up and maintain their respective distances. Now, one of the things that we have in GDA 2 is that these supports can take as much extra movement as they need to stay in those support positions. Once we're at the 5 centimetre point, the defenders will issue their defensive fire if they're able to, and we will then resolve the actual charge itself. The charge is now resolved. So, if the lead battalion is in good shape, you'll roll 2d6 with potential support re-rolls for your supports. If your column suffered casualties going in or has become unformed, you'll roll 3d6 and take the 2 lower scores. If you've taken very heavy casualties and are also unformed, you'll roll 4d6 and take the 2 lowest scores. This 2d6 final score, as mentioned, can be modified by supports, the fact you might be a higher troop grade, etc, etc. Once we've done that for the attackers, the defenders will also do that. If they have supports, they can get their re-rolls, and so on. Finally, we compare the difference between the 2 scores to ascertain the charge outcome. So you'll note the process is the same as General Dame 1, we're just using different methods to get there. So the important changes in the charge phase are only 1 charge declaration per brigade. Defensive supports now can either fire or re-roll a support re-roll. So they can't do both. They will either fire or provide a support re-roll. And of course, as we'll see through the battle and the process, charging is much quicker to carry out. So here we have an example of a charge. We have the French lead charge unit supported by its 2 sister battalions on the flank, and they are charging the Austrian line. Now, first of all, we ascertain what dice we use based on the condition of your unit. Now, the Austrians are fresh, they've not taken casualties, they're a good quality unit, so they will roll 2d6. If they had any supports, they could obviously then use re-rolls if they wish to do so. Now, the French lead charge battalion, as we'll see, has suffered 6 casualties, which means it's worn. Now, if you're worn in the charge, or as we mentioned before, unformed, you will add an extra dice to your hand. So here we'll see that the French player has rolled 3 dice, and what he does, because he's suffered those casualties, he will remove the higher dice and just uses the 2 lower dice scores. So you'll see how that impacts his score. So currently he was losing to the Austrians, and no doubt he will need to use his re-rolls from his 2 supports to try and get that battered battalion to push its charge home. Now we're at the movement phase. In the movement phase, players move their respective units, infantry battalions, cavalry regiments and artillery batteries. The phasing player that's the player with the initiative, will move his units first, followed by the opponent. Units may move up to their maximum distance for their current formation, or conduct formation changes such as column to line or line to square. Brigades that have a forwards ADC tasking will have significantly increased movement. However, the downside of this is the units that use that extra movement will lose the opportunity to fire. As mentioned in the previous video, there are two phases to the movement phase. The tactical movement phase, which we've just mentioned, and the reserves movement phase. So now all your standard movement that's on table will be carried out first, and reserves will not move or enter the table until after all that's finished. What that does is it means that the opponent cannot react instantly to the arrival of your reserves. Terrain has its impact upon movement as one would expect. Woods, streams will usually reduce movement for close order units. We also have built up areas such as villages, strong points, and we now have fortified villages which combine strong point within a village. So the important changes are to mention for GDA 2 that skirmishers are no longer subject to the hesitant movement rule. So if your brigade is hesitant, although your close order units cannot advance towards the enemy, your skirmishers can. The phase is split into tactical movement for units on table and reserve movement for your reserves coming in from off table. Now we move to firing. In the fire phase, both players execute skirmish, artillery and volley fire from their respective units. Firing is now, under GDA 2, split into three distinct sub-phases. So we have skirmishers firing first, both sides will fire, then we have artillery, and then finally we have infantry volleys. So let's see how a brigade skirmish line fires. A brigade skirmish screen starts with 1d6 and adds an extra d6 into your hand for each base in the screen. So a 4 base screen would roll 5 dice. The usual modifiers apply, such as cover, etc. The player will then roll these casualty dice all together, and every score of 4 or more is a hit. However, because they're skirmishers, 2 hits will equal 1 casualty. There's nothing for a half in this game, so you need 2 hits for 1 casualty. So let's have a look at how this works. Here we have a brigade skirmish screen of 4 bases. We know we start with 1 base, and then we get an extra dice for each base in the unit, so that's 5 dice. And I roll all 5 dice together, and I've scored 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So we know that every 4 plus is a hit. So in our hand there we've got just 2 hits, the 4 and the 5. 2 hits equals 1 casualty. So that will cause 1 casualty on the target unit. Artillery and volley fire is very much the same as it was under General Dame 1. Players roll 2d6 for each unit, apply modifiers, which are the standard wargame modifiers, and then consult the casualty chart. Instead of pluses and minuses for your modifiers, the fire modifiers now, if they're negatives, will simply drag your volley down to the next volley line. So if you start at a standard volley and you're firing at someone in cover, you'll simply move down to the inferior volley line. Benefits to your firing, such as being elite or firing canister, etc., now simply give you extra casualty dice in your hand. Again, casualty dice work exactly the same as they did in GDA 1. You score a 4 plus, you'll get an extra casualty. So let's see how this works in practice. Here we have an infantry line firing at an enemy skirmish screen. The infantry are fresh and they have no issues with them regarding their troop grading. Let's just call them line for ease of play. So the only negative modifier that will apply to this line is the fact that they're firing at skirmishers. So all we do is, instead of looking at the standard volley line, we simply move down to the inferior volley line because one negative modifier is applying. We then roll our 2d6, look at the table, and in this instance we've rolled 8, and 8 on an inferior volley will cause 1 casualty on the skirmishers. That's it. The final part of the fire phase is discipline tests. Now, effective enemy fire can cause a discipline test upon the target unit. This is very similar to the system used under GDA 1. The player who's suffering the discipline test simply takes his troop grade and applies any modifiers that will affect that unit before rolling 2d6. Now, in a similar method to firing, instead of using pluses and minuses under a discipline test, a positive means you will be promoted to the next better troop grade, whereas a negative will demote you to the next worse troop grade. So for instance, if you were a line unit and had, say, heavy casualties, you would suffer a demotion and you'd now test as reservists. Again, it's a simple 2d6 roll, hoping to pass the test. And if you pass, you're fine, and of course if you fail, bad things might happen. So the important differences between the first edition and the second edition in the fire phase are, first of all, moving units do not suffer as badly as they did under GDA 1. There's still a negative, but it's not as impactful. Secondly, skirmisher firepower is now far more consistent, but can be powerful if you're using the skirmisher's fire tasking. Also, artillery ammunition is now dealt with via artillery caissons. Each division starts with 2 artillery caissons, and they can be used to replenish ammunition, to recover batteries from a worn status, which represents additional men and guns moving up to supplement the battery, or to permit assault fire when the battery is worn. The crucial part of this is deciding when best to use your limited artillery caissons. And that's it for the fire phase. The final phase of the turn is the combat phase. The melee system or combat system uses casualty dice exactly as we did under General Dame 1. Each casualty dice will inflict a single casualty on a score of 4, 5 or 6, or no casualties are inflicted on a score of 1, 2 or 3. Infantry and cavalry start with 5 casualty dice and artillery starts with just 3. There are then the usual modifiers that are applied for combat, associated with better melee potential, superior morale grade, formation, your casualty level, etc. And then all these modifiers either bring more or less dice to your hand. And then of course success is determined by who gets more hits and the difference between the winning score and the losing score. So here we have an example of combat. We have the French Dragoon Regiment opposing an Austrian Chevaulegers or Dragoon Regiment. Now, if we look at the French, they're a standard line campaign cavalry regiment. They're not a superior morale grade, they're not heavy cavalry or elite or anything, so they will gain the standard 5 dice. Now the Austrians, as we can see from the casualty indicator, have suffered heavy casualties. In General Dame 2, any unit that's on 6 or more is classed as worn. Now in combat, that means the Austrians will lose 1 casualty dice. So in our combat here, the French roll 5 casualty dice, and as you can see, they've scored 3 hits. Our Austrians have rolled 4 casualty dice and only scored 2 hits. So in the first round, the French are the winners, but as you'll see from the casualty charts, there is a potential for a second round with cavalry. So, what are the important changes that we have in the second edition in the combat phase? First of all, combats are now restricted to 1 unit versus 1 unit in the first round. If there's a second round, which will only be garrison combat or cavalry combat, reinforcements are again limited to 1 unit per side. And finally, villages can be set on fire. So, the end of the combat phase marks the end of the game turn, and that completes our overview of the General Dame 2 game turn. I'll see you in the next video.